Welcome back to another episode of Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. On this episode, we'll pick up from Dale's return to the States from the European front, where the war has just ended, his track from Boston to Kansas City, where his future wife, Virginia Hampton, meets up with him and they travel back to his hometown in Kansas to get married, their honeymoon in Colorado, and his escapades there, and where they finally end up when the war ends for good. So sit back and enjoy this episode. Welcome back to another episode of Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. On our last episode, the European war has ended. Dale has made it back to the United States safe and sound and is now in Boston, but the war in the South Pacific, the Asian theater, is still going on at this time, so we'll pick it up from there. So Pop, you made it to Boston. As we were discussing right before the segment, you were, this is the last time you'd ever flown to B-24.
That's right. From then on, it was a strange situation. Anyway, we left Boston, assigned, and I was in charge of the train load of troops of the 8th Air Force. Then we were going to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for restaging. We were going to get a month's rest period.
R&R.
Before we reassigned. I'd call my wife-to-be in Blue Ridge. And,
Virginia, the one that you had met in Smyrna at a dance.
That's right.
Yeah.
And while I was overseas all the time, and we did a lot of correspondence, and I'd always tell her we were going to get married in June, but I had no way of knowing that the war would be over and that would be possible for anything like that. Well, I called her and told her we was coming through Kansas City on our train, and I was going to get off in Kansas City, and I'd meet her at I think the Mulesock or something hotel. And so she got on the train and came there to Kansas City, and then I got off. We met there, and we caught a train from there, Kansas City, down to Wichita, and my folks met us there in Wichita, and we got home. On our trip back to the States, we'd left England in June the 14th and got in the States June the 18th. At the time we got back to Kansas and I got home, it was June the 25th. Her folks came by train, and the trains were just crowded. They couldn't even find a seat. They had to sit on their suitcases from Blue Ridge. I think they had to go to Chicago and back down through to Kansas City and on down to Wichita, and to attend our wedding.
And this is back in the day whenever pretty much everything was transported by train.
That's right.
Everything, Army personnel, of course, they were using it hot and heavy during that time because they were transporting military personnel by train, plus civilians, plus cargo and everything else. So it was very active at that time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, we got home on the 25th to my folks' home. Her folks got there a day or two before the wedding, and we got married the last day of June.
Cutting it short, weren't you?
We were cutting it short, but we got married in June, and we couldn't believe that it worked out like it did.
Ooh.
Well, I had a month off, and we went on our honeymoon out to Colorado and visited a lot of the sites in Colorado, and I think we've gone about 10 days on that, and then we come back. And
you you didn't have a car, so you had to borrow someone's car then, didn't you?
Well, my dad had this 1940 Ford, and but you had to have stamps to buy gasoline.
Yeah.
And they give us a small amount of gas for having served overseas, but it wasn't near enough to make that kind of a trip. So my brothers that are farming, they give me some gas coupons of that used on the farm, and I didn't go and get my supply of coupons that are supposed to be issued to me. We got out to Denver, Colorado. I went to the draft board, or the control board for all these stamps, and I talked to the secretary and told her I hadn't got my stamps, and she says, well, where you come from? And I told her, well, how did you get here? And I said, well, my brothers have given me some stamps, and I says, we was able to get out here. She says, if you got enough stamps to get home, you better not go into that board. They'll take these stamps away from you, the farming stamps. So I left out of there. We did have enough to get us on back home.
Yeah. Of course, some viewers may not know this or know the history, but during the World War II, everything was rationed. Gasoline, oil, food, butter, milk. I mean, just everything. Dylon, you know, it just, everything was being rationed, so it was all being used for the war effort. So you only had so much that civilians could use, and the rest of it went to the war effort because, you know, they were needing all the supplies that they could get for fighting the war in 2 different fronts and all. So
after the month that we was given for a rest and recuperation, then I was assigned to Alamogordo, New Mexico. We got down there. It was a base of B-29s. That was the biggest airplane that they built during the war, but it never was used in Europe. It was used in the South Pacific. It had longer range and bigger capacity of carrying bombs and everything. So the first thing, when I got down there, a captain come around and says, you've got quite a bit of time in the B-24? And I says, yes. He says, I need a co-pilot on the B-29 because I'm a test pilot. And he says, I'd like for you to fly with me on, because every plane that goes into the shop, do you have any work done on it? Well, he'd have to take it out and check it out before they could put it back in service. So I got to flying on that B-29 right from the very beginning when I got there at the base. But we also were being trained to fly the B-29 because the talk was that they was going to invade Japan, and they was getting all the planes that they could into the South Pacific and all the personnel to make the invasion. I made some long trips. One trip on a B-29, we took off one afternoon, and we flew to Los Angeles from Alamogordo, New Mexico. Just got there just as the sun went down, and we flew out over the Catalina Islands and turned around. Time we come back, the lights all were on in Los Angeles, but there was a little cloud cover over it, and you just saw the glow of the town. And then halfway back to Alamogordo, we flew over Oregon Mountain, and there was a base there, and we was flying along there, and one of the crew boys says, what does flak look like? And just about that time, they sent up a shell that had burst about 1,000 yards to our left as a warning that we were getting in close to the territory that we wasn't supposed to be in.
And where was this?
That was in New Mexico, one of the missile bases, and where the nuclear bomb was.
Oh, okay, yeah. So you
area and so forth.
Right, yeah.
And I says, that's what it looks like. I never had anything coincidental just as they asked me that, there that thing went off right off to our
See
left.
that?
And if the war had lasted 2 more weeks or a month, I'd have been in the South Pacific flying a B-29 because I was getting training in it at that time.
But that was probably about the time that the atomic bombs were being dropped on.
Well, they just ignited that first one in the desert out there, just about 50 miles from Alamogordo, in that sand deserted area out there. And that was quite a talk of the country at that time. And then they, while we were there, that's when they dropped the one on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
And that stopped the war right there. They finally gave up, and we didn't have to invade. That would have been a terrible invasion, because they were so preparing for the invasion, and we'd have lost a lot of personnel.
There's been a lot of debate over the years whether it was the right thing to do to drop the atomic bomb on those 2 cities and stuff. And yes, it was a horrible, horrible loss of life, of civilian life, because it not only affected, you know, the Army and military, but it affected citizens as well, private citizens. But in reality, you look at it, it probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives of not only Americans that might have had to invade and try to fight the Japanese, and the Japanese were trained at that time that nobody was going to take them, even the citizens. And you know, there's stories from where, you know, during the war where they were fighting on these islands in the South Pacific, where the Americans, Allied forces, were getting close to, you know, villages and stuff, and that the whole village, men,
well,
women,
they were doing so much bombing of Japan, and their housing structures were very flimsy and very easy to ignite. Our fire bombing of their towns just about destroyed so much of their cities in Japan. Statistics say that of all the casualties of war, 70% of the casualties are civilians. And that's what happens when you have to bomb big cities and industrial sites.
That was back in the days when we didn't have nothing compared, you know, as far as accurate bombing and stuff of, you know, it was basically carpet bombing and stuff. But the Japanese had a mindset that they wasn't going to surrender at all, and they would literally commit mass suicide to keep from surrendering to the Allied forces and stuff.
That's right.
And, you know, it was a horrible situation, but it came to the point where we used the atomic bomb, and as bad as it was, it made them decide that it was better just to give up than to keep on trying to fight us, because if we had any more of those bombs, we would completely annihilated them. Although they didn't know at the time, we didn't have any more bombs.
That's right. They were just they were under the destruction of a pretty large air force that was being very effective on Japan at that time. And regardless of the atomic bomb, it would have been very devastating to their towns and cities and everything, because we was close enough to support within range of bombing all the country.
But getting back to your story, the war basically ended. They dropped the 2 atomic bombs. Japan surrendered, so you were still in Alamogordo, New Mexico at that time, right?
Well, yes, I was. I was transferred up to Clovis, New Mexico.
Oh, Clovis, New Mexico.
Mom and I sent up there. But back there at Alamogordo, when I was there, a lot of the kitchen personnel that prepared the food for all the base personnel were German war prisoners of war. and they were workers, and they were so thankful to be out of the war and be in the United States. They were just as happy as could be to be working in the kitchen, and they prepared and put out some mighty good food at that time.
And probably after the war ended, they eventually
stayed
here.
Them ended up being American citizens. One of the things that happened when I was at Clovis, New Mexico, and on the air base there, they assigned me to fly a bunch of majors and colonels up to Denver, Laurie Field, Denver, I believe it is, to a football game right there at the end of the war. I went out to get in the plane. I thought it was going to be a B-24. It wasn't. It was a B-17. And I'd never sat in a seat of a B-17 up to that time. And crawled in, and then my co-pilot, I introduced myself and asked him how much time he had in this B-17. He says, "This is my first time." So both of us had never flown a B-17 or sat in a seat of it before. Well,
y'all were just lost.
I says, "It don't bother me to fly this plane." I says, "I don't know the controls or the settings and where they're at and everything." I called up the engineer that's assigned to each plane. There's always an engineer that's responsible for that.
And he actually, he stays with that plane the whole time, doesn't he?
Yes, he stays with that plane all the time. Yeah. When it flies, he flies. My crew, I had one that flew with every mission that I was ever on in the B-24. But anyway, I called him up and I says, "You stand right here, and when I need some help on knowing what the control or what the setting is, I need you right here to show me what I need to know." And we flew that plane up to Denver, and we never told all that bunch of there must have been 15 at least
colonels,
majors and colonels in the back. They were mostly desk personnel, administrative personnel, and we didn't have one iota of problems on that trip. If they'd have known that neither one of those boys up there flying had never flown that airplane before, they'd all bail out.
That's amazing because, you know, there's quite a bit of difference in between the B-24 and the B-17. The B-17, of course, a lot of people knows the B-17. The B-24 was the actual workhorse, and there was a lot more of the B-24s that was produced and used during World War II, but the B-17 got all the glory.
Yes,
they were, you know, the B-17 was called the Flying Fortress. The B-24 it was called the Liberator. That was its nickname, the Liberator.
That's right.
But they didn't, the B-24s and the crews didn't get as much of the glory as the B-17s, but
we did more of the work. Our B-24 was used in more types of support of the war than any other plane. It was used as hauling freight. It transported the president and big wigs, different things. It was used as a plane to spot and drop death bombs on submarines.
Submarines, right.
Submarine patrol. Mm-hmm. It was used in so many different areas.
But it was a high wing plane. It had tricycle gear, landing gear. But the B-17 was a low wing, very broad wing, which made it very stable in flight, but it didn't have as big of a payload as a B-24.
17 was a
tail
dragger,
yeah,
and the 24 had a nose wheel.
That's why I was saying tricycle gear.
Tricycle.
Yeah.
And
they
were different. You had to handle them different in landing. Takeoff is about the same, but landing, you had to get it in a certain position, you had to stall your 17 out to keep it on the ground, because when the tail wheel went down, that made it in a position to take off again. So you had to be ready to stall when you landed with 17. 24, you could get it down on the runway. It's just more like it was in flying position. It didn't start wanting to come back up like 17
now,
did.
Between you flew the B-24, obviously a lot during the war, flew it back and everything, and then you had some experience flying as a co-pilot in the B-29, but the B-17, that one time that you did get to fly it and everything, how is it compared to the B-24?
The 17, it flew like an arrow. It was just as smooth and stable.
Yeah.
The 24, you just had to manhandle the thing, and
it just wallered, and
it needed a little longer body, and they did increase the length of the body and more stabilized it.
And another thing about the B-24, I've never seen a B-24 myself in person. I have seen a couple of B-17s. I've caught them down at Cherokee County Airport down there. I've actually saw them up close and personal. Never got to fly them, but anyway, they had a really broad wing, which made it much more stable, whereas the wings on the B-24, which was more narrow, which didn't give it quite as much lift and made it less stable in flight, and especially when you got up to higher altitudes.
Was thick up at the front, and it gradually come back to the back part of the wing.
Tapered off.
It would fly at a higher altitude than what our 24 would,
right?
Because it had better lift position. Right. The 24 was what they call a Davis wing, and it went up and over and back down and then leveled out, and that suction as it went over, that helped lift the thing. But when you're up there where there's no air, right, at high altitude, it didn't have the lift that you needed. 23,000 feet was the loads is about our maximum. They could get up to 25,000 feet with a 17.
That's pretty good.
So the higher you get, the little safer it is, because the flak guns are less accurate the higher you go. That's just more space that they've got to try to cover.
Well, getting back to the story you was telling about the first time and probably the only time that you ever got to fly a B-17, you made it, no incident, took the colonels and majors to their destination, got them back, and no one was the wiser for it about that incident?
Nothing ever come up about it. I think they all learned about it, but there was no big issue that came up about it.
Fortunately, nothing ever happened, so you know what, no big deals.
Well, the war was getting over at that time, and all they wanted to do was get the Army reduced and the boys home as quick as they could. Yeah. But I was sent to.
Well, let's end this episode right there. We'll pick up from that point on the next episode.
Yeah.
I want to thank everyone again for watching Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. Thank you for being with us. If you like this episode, give it a like. If you like hearing history from a 100-year-old greatest generation man from World War II, like our channel and watch all of them and catch up if you hadn't already. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and if you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like below and consider supporting our channel by clicking on the subscribe button as well. If you have any questions or suggestions for content, please leave a comment below and we will be sure to read them. And to be notified of any new uploads, turn on notifications at the upper right hand corner of your screen, and we will see you in our next episode.